Hello class, this is the lecture of America in the World. Hopefully this will be the last lecture that, well, I take that back. You will have an online lecture the week that I'm not going to be there, which is coming up pretty fast. But hopefully this is the last one that we have to have outside of them to make up for the time that we lost due to 2 snow days. Now, last class period, and going into the class period, well, hopefully you guys have watched this before Monday. But last class period, we were talking about the rise of the new upper class, the middle class, and the working class. Class period for the coming week, we'll be talking about the populists and the progressives. Now, during this time period, in the late 1800s, the United States will grow into an empire. And the question I have is, the reason why I have empire in quotes is, was it an empire? I'm going to ask you this in class, probably on Wednesday. What do I mean by empire? Was America an empire in the traditional sense of going and conquering territories, ruling them like the Europeans did starting in the 1870s, going all the way up to World War I? Or was it another kind of empire? You'll get to see what I think at the end of this lecture. Now, American foreign policy and diplomacy between 1865 and the 1890s is really, well, not concerned with foreign affairs. It's not to say that the United States does not have international relations with other countries of the world. We do. We've got ambassadors and embassies and consulates all over the world. However, the U.S. government, and more importantly, the U.S. people, seem disinterested in world affairs during most of this time. The United States is concentrating on basically building a nation between the boundaries of the Atlantic and the Pacific. We have homesteading going on. We have the expansion into the West. We have railroad expansion. And we've got to protect all of this. We've got to protect the homesteaders, pioneers. We've got to protect the railroadmen. And so the U.S. government is actively fighting Indians between the 1860s and the 1890s. This is the time period of what is known as the Indian Wars. We talked about this in previous lectures. This doesn't mean that the United States is not having, diplomatic relations with other countries. But these relations are limited. For example, American foreign policy is not really directed at areas outside of the Western Hemisphere. Instead, the American foreign policy establishment is concentrating on what might be called Pan-Americanism. During the time period between the 1870s and 1890s, the U.S. government is trying to build stronger relations with other American countries. Remember, we're not the only Americans. If you take into account Central America and South America, you have Americans down there. Now, in Latin America, these are countries that are relatively young too. Mexico, the countries of Central and South America, most of them did not receive their independence until the 1820s and 1830s. So they are even younger than the United States. Starting in 1823, President James Monroe issued what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is simple. Those new countries emerging from the leftovers of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere would be protected by the United States. The President Monroe basically was telling European countries not to interfere in the internal development of these new Latin American countries. Now, while the Monroe Doctrine is basically saying that the United States will act as sort of the big brother protector of these Latin American countries, It does not explicitly say that the United States will take an active hand itself in these countries. However, the implication is clear. The United States would be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. And beginning after the U.S. Civil War, American policymakers start to make diplomatic inroads in creating a sort of what you might call a Western hemispherical relationship with these Latin American countries. It's in the 1870s that you see the formation of what becomes known as the Pan-American Congress or the Pan-American Conference. This still meets every year. This isn't like the EU. It's not a government. What it is basically an economic, political, and diplomatic dialogue that was founded at this time in the 1870s that continues on to this day, where the various foreign policy parts of the government of the United States, of Mexico, of Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, where their ambassadors meet on a yearly basis all together, to discuss issues that are in common with the countries of the Western Hemisphere. So the United States is taking an active role in diplomatic policy, but it's limiting itself in terms of what it is doing at this time. Now, the United States is also acquiring territory. We acquire Alaska and Hawaii in the time period between the end of the American Civil War and the 1890s. Alaska we get peacefully. We buy it. We buy it from the Russians. The Russian Empire is strapped for cash in the late 1860s, and they think that Alaska is nothing but a wasteland. So they offer it to the United States for the grand total of 2 pennies per acre. Now, this is still a considerable sum, since Alaska is, it's the largest state in the Union now. It is a large piece of territory, and the United States wants it not because of the mainland. Many Americans feel that Alaska is just as much a wasteland as the Russians did. What the United States government wants Alaska for are the Aleutian Islands, that little tail of islands that comes off of Alaska. Why? Because the American fishing fleet needs a home port further north than the American West Coast. Sounds like, the deadliest catch. However, American interest in Alaska will change because in the 1870s something is discovered there that, of course, draws in many Americans and causes Alaska, the mainland of Alaska, to develop rapidly. This, of course, is gold, found in the Klondike. Now, the Klondike is an area shared between Alaska and the northernmost part of Canada, the Northwest Territory. That is the northernmost part of actual land before you start getting to just ice in the Arctic Circle. So this is a very inhospitable area of the world, but it draws in many American gold seekers and helps develop Alaska and founds many of its cities further south. Now, on the other side of the coin, you have the acquisition of Hawaii. Now, Hawaii was an independent kingdom before the 1870s. Now, in 1875, the United States government will declare a protectorate over the islands. Now, this is what this means is that the United States unilaterally declares that the United States will protect the islands of Hawaii. It doesn't mean that we will rule them, because even as late as 1875, Hawaii is a monarchy ruled by this woman that you see here on the screen. This is Queen Liliuokalani. Now, Queen Liliuokalani is the last monarch of Hawaii. What happens to the Queen? What happens to the monarchy of Hawaii? Well, beginning around 1875, the reason why the U.S. government declared a protectorate over Hawaii is American businessmen were starting to take a very intense interest in Hawaii. Hawaii is a perfect agricultural area of the world. It has a 12-month growing season. It's incredibly nice, and many of the crops that we often sort of take for granted as being Hawaiian crops are not even native to Hawaii. Like, for example, bananas, pineapples, sugar. All of these crops that we think of as, well, these come from Hawaii, well, they originally originated from either Africa or South America. It's American business that introduces these crops to Hawaii, and as a result, American businessmen become incredibly influential in Hawaiian politics. Starting in the 1880s, American businessmen are seen as a threat by the native Hawaiians. And so the Hawaiian monarchy tries to limit the influence of these American businessmen by passing such laws as limitations on the size of property that a company or an individual can own. Well, American businessmen retaliate and they help stage a coup. And by 1893, they depose Queen Liliuokalani and replace her with a government of their choice. And in 1898, the U.S. government will basically step in and declare Hawaii to be a possession, a territory, not a state, but a territory of the United States. Now, up until the 1890s, these attempts at expansion are pretty limited because Americans are too concerned with filling up the interior of the United States. And as we talked about in previous classes, when this frontier finally closes, ceases to exist, in 1890, for example, this acts as a shock to the American consciousness. Americans had been a frontier people. We had defined ourselves as people who settled the wilderness, hacked out civilization. But what happens when there's no frontier, no wilderness to hack civilization out from? Well, that American desire to move west, to move into new territories, will start to look to lands overseas to expand. And a good illustration of the change in the frontier, to show you how quickly it fills up, is here's newspaper circulation circa the 1860s. These little dots illustrate the consumption, if you will, how many subscriptions there were to a particular newspaper. As you can see, most of the newspapers are here. The American Midwest, and especially the Northeast corridor. And you have a good smattering down here in the South. You have a good showing here in the West, but outside of Denver, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Here's the 1890s. Not only has newspapers and newspaper subscriptions grown here in the areas where they were already existing, you can see that here in the West, there is no continuous line of void, of not filled up area, because every one of these dots, every one of these dots represents at least one newspaper with subscribers, and not all Americans are subscribing to newspapers. So this acts as a relative or a good example, an analogy of how fast the frontier fills up. So by the 1890s, the United States, and especially the American public, has no frontier to discover, has no frontier to colonize. And so the American mindset will begin to shift to looking further west, ironically enough, to the east, especially to Asia and Latin America. Because it's not the U.S. government that leads the way, it is American business that leads the way. American business in the period immediately after the American Civil War had been aided considerably by foreign capital. Because this is how it works. Businesses that have made it, that have established themselves in places like Great Britain, now are producing wealth. They have liquid capital that they need to find investments for. Because you don't make money by spending money. You make money by investing money. So between 1860 and 1890, American industry, American steel mills, American meat packing plants are invested in by foreign capital. mainly British capital. But by the 1890s, the role of investor has now been assumed by American businessmen. American businessmen wanting to expand and diversify their industries. For example, America is looking for new markets to sell things like Standard product or Standard Oil, to sell Fords, to sell new cars, to sell American lumber goods and manufactured goods, but also to invest, to expand American business into, for example, Hawaii, but also to expand into Central and South America. Any of you who have eaten Doyle lately, Doyle pineapple or Doyle mixed fruit. Doyle's original name was the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company would invest heavily in pineapple plantations, banana plantations, and other agricultural investments in places like Honduras, Nicaragua, and other Latin American countries. They're looking for new markets, and in doing so, American business brand the world. What do I mean by branding? Well, when I say I need to blow my nose, what do you say I should reach for? You don't say facial tissue usually. You say grab a Kleenex. Well, Kleenex is a brand name. I cut my finger. Do I get an adhesive bandage strip or do I get a Band-Aid? If I want something to drink, a soda, do I say a soda or a pop like they do in the North? No, down here in the South, I say I'm going to get a Coke, regardless of what it is. That's not a Coke right there. And so during this time period, American business brands the world. How does it brand the world? Well, it brands it in that poor individuals in Latin American countries, for example, will scavenge the oil tins from garbage dumps that have Standard Oil printed on them. They'll cut these things up and use them for shingles on their houses, so that anybody driving down the road, when they see these shacks, free advertising, words that we sort of associate with a particular type of car will become the generic term for an automobile in many countries, especially in Latin America. For example, up until the 1930s and 1940s, if you went to Latin America, they didn't call cars cars. They called them Fords, regardless of whether it was a Ford, a Chevy, or an Opel from Germany. And as American business, I should say, stretches out and makes inroads into other countries, American business becomes more influential not only in those countries but also in the United States government. American business takes an active interest in American foreign policy, and this is especially true in American policy toward China. Because American businessmen look at China and see the perfect market. You have a very populous nation. Even back then, China was the most populous nation in the world. And they lacked everything. They lacked cars. They lacked manufactured products. They didn't have all of these things. And so American businessmen, in the simple logic, says you got a lot of people that don't have this stuff. There is the ultimate market, the so-called China market. Now, in many respects, the China market will be a figment of American businessmen's imagination, because one thing American businessmen fail to realize, many of the people in China, 90 to 99% of the people in China, are dirt poor. They do not have the money to buy the products that American business will be selling. Likewise, the wealthier Chinese in Chinese society, why do they want to buy American products like a tractor, for example, when it's easier just to hire a bunch of poor Chinese laborers who will work for half the cost? So while American businessmen try to tap into the China market and consistently really don't make the inroads that they're wanting to make, they are pressuring the American government to get involved in foreign policy in the East, in the Far East. Now, while the economic pressure for expansion is growing, so is public pressure. America is not isolated from the rest of the world. Americans see that other countries, especially European countries, Great Britain especially, are colonizing and taking over the world. By the 1890s, Great Britain has an empire that the sun supposedly never sets on because they have possessions in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, even a few limited ones here still in the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, for example, Jamaica. And you have your own American nationalist, American imperialist. These are Americans who, like their European counterparts, want to expand American influence around the world. What justifies this spreading of American influence? Well, American imperialists, I should say, subscribe to the notion of what you might call what is called Anglo-Saxonism. Anglo-Saxonism is a belief that is permeating European society at this time. It is a belief that Western European society, or Anglo-Saxon society, so Britain, France, Germany, and the other countries that sort of are right in there, are the best, most advanced cultures ever. And this is supported by the social Darwinism of the age. And so this idea that since the United States is an outgrowth of Anglo-Saxon culture in Europe, we too need to go forth and take over the world. Now, this expansionist attitude finds a strange bedfellow in the traditional American Christian missionary impulse. American missionaries and many American Christians argue that the United States should go forth and colonize the world, not because we are culturally better, but because this is a means of bringing the Word of God to the masses, especially to areas of the world that we consider savages. Asia, for example. So you have this unique combination of economic interest, cultural supremacy, and the missionary impulse, all combining together to help build this undercurrent of expansionist philosophy. So what's the catalyst? What really crystallizes this idea that America needs to practice manifest destiny abroad? Well, it's penned by this man right here. This is U.S. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan was the head of the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He was also a vehement expansionist. Mahan believed that the United States needed to have an overseas empire, and of course he argued that the only way to support that overseas empire was to build a navy, a modern navy. Now you guys might find this humorous and you might find this interesting, that in 1890, when other countries of the world have all steel navies, or all the ships are made out of steel, steam powered, the United States its navy is still made up of wooden ships held over from the Civil War. Our navy is ancient in comparison to other industrialized nations. And by the 1890s, the United States is the industrial powerhouse of the world, yet our military forces, our navy, seem like something out of an ancient era. Well, Mahan, wanting to justify a building program to basically replace that wooden navy, writes a pivotal and very influential book. It's called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. In this, Mahan's not really making a present argument for a modern navy. He's making an historical argument. This is the type of argument that I want you guys to make. Because what he is arguing is not saying, we need a navy now. He says, this is how Britain became the world power that it is. And his argument was simple. They did it because they had the world's best navy, and they still have the world's best navy. Now, the implication of his argument is clear. For the United States to be a world power, it must have a similarly powerful navy. And so this seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, will be sort of the culminating idea. It will crystallize all of these ideas of manifest destiny abroad, of expansionism, into one concise argument. Because American imperialists, on the one hand, want to mimic European expansion. They want to find a place at the table of world powers. But at the same time, they make this argument that the only way to keep the European powers from growing too big and thus shutting the United States out of world markets is that the United States needs to take a place at the world table as a world power to force our way onto the world stage. Because if we don't limit European power, we will be basically overtaken by it. So if this is the crystallizing element, what is the match? What is the match that really sets off the America's imperial experiment? That is war. It is the Spanish-American War. Now, up until 1898, American political leaders had kept the United States basically out of war and really out of the experiment of, empire building. President William McKinley, who had been elected in 1896, had wanted to keep the United States out of world affairs. But growing public opinion would drive the U.S. government into declaring war in 1898 upon the aging and dying empire of Spain. Now, unlike other European powers, the Spanish Empire was in decline. The Spanish Empire was basically a remnant of the old empire that Spain had built, starting with Columbus. They had already lost most of their most of their possessions in the Western Hemisphere. They'd lost Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina. All of these countries in Central and South America had gotten their independence by the 1820s and 1830s. The only thing that the Spanish really had left in the world were some islands in the Caribbean and islands in the Pacific, most notably the Philippines. They had no real colonies in Africa outside of Spanish Morocco. They had no colonies in Asia. They were a ghost of their former self. As a result, Spanish nationalists wanted to hold on to their remaining empire as best they could. So when Cubans start to rise up and try and throw off the shackles of Spanish imperial rule in the late 1800s, the response by the Spanish is brutal. It's downright brutal. The Spanish will go and round up entire villages and force them into camps, effectively concentration camps. These camps are 1/4 the size of the towns that these people come from. So disease and starvation become endemic. They are widespread. People die by the hundreds. The Spanish use brutal tactics to suppress what we would call today insurgents. They burn down villages. They kill innocents in response to bombings and other attacks. Now, these reports of Spanish actions make it to the United States because Cuba is a very much within the sphere of America's view. It's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So Americans are taking a very intense interest in what's going on the island of Cuba. Two people in particular. These are the publishing magnates, Joseph Pulitzer, of Pulitzer Prize fame, and William Randolph Hearst. Both men own most of the newspapers in the United States. Most of your newspapers are either Pulitzer papers or Hearst papers. Both of them are ardent imperialists. They are for American expansion overseas. And the Cuban case offers a perfect way to get America into the empire building game. Because now Hearst and Pulitzer can make this argument. The United States, for moral reasons, has to help the Cuban people. We've got to help them overthrow the Spanish. And they do this not only by the news accounts coming out of Cuba from their reporters. They do this through new, unique propaganda methods. One of them is the Yellow Kid. I can't remember if it was pioneered by Pulitzer or Hearst, but one of the publishers used basically what amounts to a modern editorial cartoon. And the Yellow Kid, as he became known, was a recurring cartoon on the front pages of either the Hearst or Pulitzer paper. I can't remember which one offhand. And the Yellow Kid would vocalize, so he had a little bubble above his head, he would vocalize what was going on in Cuba from sort of a child's point of view, while the story that was factual was printed, as you can see right here, on his potato sack, clothing. The Yellow Kid was one of the first times that color was used in newspapers. Up until this time, it was basically just black ink. The Yellow Kid had to be colored. He got his name, the Yellow Kid, because he was yellow. Now, the Yellow Kid is a propaganda tool, because these imperialists are using this kind of public advertising, this way of persuading the public, to get more Americans on board to act in Cuba. And so after the war, when many people see what kind of sort of trick has been played on them, they start to call this type of journalism yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is synonymous with jingoism, and both of them are warmongering. Both of them are trying to get the public to go to war. And so this public pressure, this jingoism, finally forces President McKinley to act. And so in 1898, he sends the USS Maine, one of these first new all-steel warships of the Great White Fleet, to Havana Harbor. The United States Navy is going to, quote, show the flag. It's an implied threat, if you will, because the U.S. Navy is there to basically show Spanish authorities that we are well aware of what's going on this island, and here is what we can do about it. Well, the night the Maine laid anchor in Havana Harbor, it exploded. It blew up. And those that were pressuring for war immediately charged that the Spanish had sabotaged the ship. They had mined the harbor. They had done something. In Hearst and Pulitzer's papers, there were even cartoons showing shadowy figures rolling out in a rowboat with like a Jack Daniels barrel with a fuse coming out of it. Now, the interesting thing about the Maine is, more than likely, the Maine was not destroyed by any malfeasance, by any attack. It blew up on its own because of a design flaw. I wish I had a chalkboard here to show you, but I'll just try to explain this, so try and visualize this in your mind. In 1943, at the height of World War II, the U.S. Navy would raise the Maine. The Maine would basically be sitting on the bottom of the harbor from 1898 to 1943. They would raise the Maine. They'd put the ship in a dry dock, and they would look at what happened. They would look at the twisted metal of this ship. What they found is there was no evidence of outside explosion, but every indication of an internal explosion. Where it originated from is interesting, because in these old warships, you have coal bunkers. Coal was the power source for these ships at this time. And coal, it's a rock, it's coal, chunks of coal. These chunks of coal would sometimes rub together. And rubbing together, just like you rub your hands together, they would spontaneously combust. Not in a raging fire, but just a low burning ember. Well, the problem is the coal bunker fire that the U.S. Navy traced the explosion back to happened in a coal bunker that was right next to the main powder magazine, where all the black powder for the main guns was stored. So imagine this. Some coal that's right up against the wall starts rubbing together. A fire breaks out and grows. It heats up that steel, that single piece of steel between the coal bunker and the powder magazine, heating it up to the point where finally that black powder catches on fire and detonates. That's probably what happened to the Maine, but American imperialists in 1898 really didn't care. And so the United States will go to war with Spain in 1898. The world's premier industrial power against a dying empire. As you can guess, we win. This is not an easy win, however. Some battles are incredibly easy. For example, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, commanded by U.S. Admiral George Dewey, no relation to Thomas Dewey. I think it's Thomas or Charles Dewey of, the reformer for education. But George Dewey, the admiral, will lead the U.S. Asiatic Squadron into Manila Harbor in the Philippines and completely just annihilate the Spanish ships that are there, the Spanish squadron. Likewise, U.S. naval forces will sail into Santiago Harbor in Cuba, which is right about here. That's right, that's Santiago Harbor, and will annihilate the Spanish squadron there as well. However, before they can do this, U.S. Army forces have to capture the gun batteries protecting this harbor. And it's during the land battle for Cuba that not only does the American government realize that our army sucks. Our army is a ghost of what it was in the 1860s, because it was poorly equipped, poorly led, and only a few individuals would make a name for themselves, most notably men like Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. But in the end, the Spanish will sue for peace, and the treaty will strip them of many of their possessions in the Western Hemisphere as well as the Pacific. The United States will declare Cuba a protectorate. We will declare Puerto Rico a territory. We will declare Guam and other islands in the Pacific territories. And we will declare the Philippines a territory of the United States. There's a problem. The Filipinos don't want to be a territory of the United States. It is the American experience fighting not the Spanish but the Filipinos that will help quash, will put an end to America's imperial experiment. Because when the United States sends troops to the Philippines in 1898 and 1899 to fight the Spanish, the Filipino nationalists, the insurrectionists that are led by Emilio Aguinaldo, welcome them as friends. However, when the Spanish finally quit, they finally, surrender, the United States, we don't withdraw. And the insurrectionists under Aguinaldo turn on the Americans because we're now seen as the occupier. And the United States will fight a bloody insurrection against the Filipinos. We will actually do things in the Philippines that were very similar to what the Spanish were doing in both the Philippines and Cuba. Now, one reason why the United States does not leave is going back to why we were setting off on this imperial experiment in the first place. To limit European expansion, because just days after Dewey destroys the Spanish fleet, he has an interesting guest. He hosts this guest on his flagship, now anchored in Manila Harbor. It is the admiral in charge of a German squadron patrolling that area. And the German admiral had one question, and it's a very important question. Was the United States staying? The implication was clear. If the United States was not planning on staying in the Philippines, the Germans were going to send in their military forces to take it over. So one reason we stay in the Philippines is to keep the Europeans out. The problem is the Filipinos don't want us there. And so again, we have to fight them in order to secure the Philippines. And as I said, some of the tactics Americans use in order to quash this insurrection are pretty brutal. I mean, we're fighting an enemy that fights very brutally themselves. Most notably, the Muslim Huks of the northern islands of Luzon. Now, how do we overcome this particular group? Well, the U.S. Army tasked an American general by the name of Arthur MacArthur with subduing the Huks. Arthur MacArthur should sound familiar because he is the father of Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame. And Arthur MacArthur and other American commanders do things like this. You fight a battle against these Muslim Filipinos. You capture say 50 or 60 of them. You set 2 or 3 aside and tell them, watch this. You execute the remaining Filipinos. You cut their tongues out and you cut their genitals off. You shove their genitals in their mouths, you put them in a mass grave, and you bury them under pig shit and pig parts, slaughtered pigs. Why would you do this? Well, in the Muslim faith, you cannot go to heaven unclean. And being contaminated with an unclean animal like a pig, either its feces or its body parts, its blood, means that you are unclean. And even if you make it into heaven, you cannot take advantage of heaven, because you will be entering heaven not a man, because your genitals are no longer with you. They're in your mouth. So these kinds of brutal tactics help subdue the Philippines. But these kind of reports, along with the casualty list, along with the tales of American soldiers basically suffering and dying in this far-off land, make it back to the American readers here in the United States. American newspaper readers become disgusted with what is going on overseas. And so public pressure shifts away from supporting American expansionism to wanting it ended. And again, this idea that we Americans, we're different. We're not these Europeans. We're not people who are suppressing people, because we are ourselves people who threw off the chains of imperialism. These ideas have a strange bedfellow as well, because while some Americans want some Americans don't want the United States to be an imperialist power because it smacks in the face of our own history. Others in this country do not want the territories that this imperial experiment would add to the United States, because historically, what happens to territories added to the country? The United States is unique in that when the United States acquires territory, all that territory of the frontier, it is organized, and then later it becomes states. States with their own senators, co-equal with other senators, and with representatives based on population. So if you are a racial supremacist from Mississippi, a supporter of Jim Crow laws, do you want territories like the Philippines, incredibly populous, not made up of white people, do you want them first to be a territory and then possibly allowed into the Union as a state? No. And so public pressure in the Deep South, in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, finds its way to support those that want to end imperialism for moral reasons. So again, you find strange allies in this fight against America's imperial experiment. So by 1900, the United States government will shy away from the type of imperialism that the Europeans practiced. So in the end, America's imperial experiment is fairly limited. We see our acquisitions here. The Alaska. Initially, we just wanted these islands right here to support American fishing. But of course, gold and then later oil would mean that Alaska becomes a much more valuable territory. Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands right here. After the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, the Protectorate of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and islands here in the Pacific. Now you might be asking why the United States would keep all of these little bitty islands. Well, again, the United States sees these islands as strategic for American interest over here in the Far East. Because look at this. American merchant ships and also warships need refueling and reprovisioning at certain stops. So if you're going to China, right here, set off from San Francisco, Hawaii, Midway, Wake, Guam, the Philippines, China. If you're going to Australia, the United States, Hawaii, these islands. I believe Jarvis was one of the more important ones. American Samoa, Australia. Because by 1900, the United States feared, and American businessmen in particular, feared that this area of the world would be locked out. America would be locked out from this area of the world. Because this part of the world, the Indies, would become known as the Dutch East Indies, because the Netherlands would control them. Britain would control Burma, India, and Malaysia, or what they called Malaya. The French would control French Indochina. The Japanese would control Korea. Australia was part of the British Commonwealth. And China, while still nominally a free country, a free kingdom, was beaten. It was turned into a weak power by wars that it fought, most notably the 1840s Opium Wars against the British. So the United States wanted to keep its access to these resources and markets open. And of course, the one way of doing that is making sure that your route to these areas of the world was secure. Now, I want you guys to think back. I'm going to just quickly go over this because we're going to start one of our classes with this, because I want to talk about these two presidents to your face. So I'm just going to cover these presidents relatively quickly, because I want you guys to look into the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. I'm going to ask you some questions because, again, I want to take this slide and this slide alone and discuss this in class. What do I mean by trust buster? Why was Teddy Roosevelt seen as a conservationist? And what is conservationism compared to, say, modern environmentalism? What are some of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did as a diplomat? What does it mean to have the president as the head diplomat? Likewise, why is Woodrow Wilson seen as the archetype progressive president? Why is Woodrow Wilson's presidency seen as the culmination of the progressive era? We'll talk about these things later in class. So I want you guys to keep these in mind. And as I said, I'm going to cover this slide in class because I would much rather have sort of a give and take discussion, not really a lecture, talking about these things with you. So I'm going to let you guys go because this is the end of the lecture. And I will see you guys on Monday. On Monday, we will talk about the populists and the progressives. We will, if we get done with that, with them, we'll talk about this last slide. And then on Wednesday, we will get into America's entry into World War I. So I hope you guys enjoy this. This is actually a relatively short lecture. And I will see you guys later on. Bye-bye.